And the first question is very predictable.
Yeah.
What is Goodvertising?
Goodvertising was for me an attempt to describe something I saw really changing in the advertising industry. I mean, I started out as a young copywriter when I was 21 years old, and always felt a little bit at odds with what the industry was doing. And but suddenly around COP21 in Copenhagen, I realized, or COP15, sorry, COP15, I realized that something was different about brands. Suddenly you had brands like Fiat talking about how they would transport their cars by train to Copenhagen. Mm-hmm. So you suddenly had these companies talk about social, environmental issues. And I wasn't really used to that. And as a marketeer and as an advertising professional, I really got curious about it because it was some of the topics that I've always been passionate about. I mean, I think if you grow up in Denmark in a welfare state, you kind of grow up with some of those values. My dad was a politician. My mom was a school teacher. So it's, you know, and they always felt at odds with me working in the ad industry. So for me, it kind of came as a natural question saying, you know, can these brands really be a force for good? Can companies really do something good for us? Or is it, you know, just a short-sighted trend that's going to disappear if there's no money in it?
Did you feel guilty? Was it a way to compensate what you had done by stepping into advertising?
I mean, being the madman Don Draper, I mean, a lot of, and I mean, I think that goes for a lot of people working in the industry that you sometimes feel a little bit at odds with it. But I mean, especially these days where we're just facing some quite immense challenges and you're pushing products. I mean, is that essentially really what we need? Do we need to sell more stuff? Don't we need to kind of find a better way of consuming? And I mean, when you have, for once, big CEOs like Paul Polman that talks about, you know, doubling growth but having environmental impact, those are the types of conversations that made me excited because essentially what brands is, it's a relationship. And I think that relationship can be used for something better than just selling more stuff. Mm-hmm.
But are you convinced, is it a new era for brands or is it just a small trend?
I mean, a lot of things is changing in our world, and I think a lot of companies are facing some quite dramatic changes these days. I mean, a lot of the discussions these days goes on the digital transformation that is happening. Mm-hmm. But I guess a lot of people forget the big societal transformations that is happening. Accenture Consulting Agency looked at global megatrends that's going to shape our future the next 30 years. For those sustainability related. One of them is climate change and resource scarcity. I mean, if you're a company like Unilever and you produce soap and you produce all these types of things, how are you suddenly going to move from having, 2 or 3 billion consumers to having 6 or 7 billion consumers? There's not enough resources. Car industry is struggling. Second one is, and I mean, I feel that in Brussels every time I'm here, urbanization, congested cities. If you're a car maker, you cannot put more cars into a city. What are you going to do? Demographic changes. I mean, average age in Europe going up. I've been quite a bit in Africa. Nigeria, the average age is 19. How do you facilitate jobs? How do you facilitate education? So I think from that perspective, this is where companies suddenly have to play a different role. And of course, the discussion is who should play that role. Is that the role of governments? Is that the role of companies? But I mean,
what do you think about it?
Being from Denmark, I think, and from a welfare state, I think it needs to be done in collaboration. But that said, I mean, companies have such an immense role to play in our society today, and they can really make an impact. I mean, if you think about Coca-Cola, they maybe touch 1 billion people that has a Coke in their hand every day. If they are going to decide to change, it's going to have a massive impact. A company like IKEA, interesting enough, their head of sustainability recently talked about we might have reached the peak of home furnishings. So people might not be able to buy more furniture in Europe, So if you're running a business, how are you going to find new business models?
So companies must play a political role now.
I think companies have to move, and this might sound harsh, but from being part of the problem to being part of the solution. I mean, and that's going to change. I mean, a lot of the companies that we see today are not going to be around tomorrow. Already the average age of companies in 1920 it was 75. Today it's 14. I mean, if we look at some of the companies, everybody talks about that, but the Ubers, the Airbnbs, I mean, they didn't exist 7 years ago. Today they're some of the world's biggest companies. So, I mean, I think a lot of companies are scared about these things and are thinking, what is our new role in this very changing landscape? And even though in some industries resource prices aren't going up, I mean, in food sector it is, but some industries it's not. But I mean, it surely will when we're getting more consumers and more people spending more money.
But sometimes in the message, the border is very slim between Goodvertising and, for instance, Greenwashing. How the consumer can make the difference?
I mean, that's very difficult. And I mean, even sometimes as a professional, it's very difficult. How do you really evaluate if this is a genuine effort by a company? And for me, it's something I even tweet about. If I catch a company doing something that I don't think is value aligned, I often go to social media and I tweet about it. So I think the power balance has changed, and I think that's a great thing, that for once we people actually have the possibility to hold these companies accountable. And I mean, one of the first things that people need to ask themselves is, of course, when they see a message, what is this company doing about it? I mean, a lot of these things are available today. So, I mean, if you're out there and you're concerned about a certain company, I would go onto their webpage and I would look into it. And if you cannot find it, call them.
But practically, is there any contradiction between doing something good for the sake of the planet or doing something good because it's good for the shareholders? I mean, practically, the result may be the same.
Yes, and I think for once we are at a point where doing good is good for business, and I think that is great. I mean, we've been too ignorant about a lot of things. I think we've lived in a society where we didn't think about waste, so we just threw things away. I think today, everybody kind of realized that waste is also an opportunity to, it's a resource that can be reused and replenished. So I think we're just getting smarter, and I think we're at the beginning of that. And I think for a lot of companies that are talking about things like circular economy, about sharing economy and exploring these new business models, I mean, it's exciting. So if you look at the pure messaging, I mean, there's so many different categories of messaging out there. I think for a lot of times you have, and this is a real challenge, how do you get consumers to behave in a more environmental manner? I mean, if you are a company like Coca-Cola, McDonald's, it doesn't look good for the company to have packaging lying on the street. That simply doesn't look good. So for a company like that, how do you actually get consumers to do the right thing? And it's very difficult. I mean, we are creatures of habits. I mean, look at New Year's resolutions. How many times we said to ourselves, "I'm going to change this," and we're not. I mean, even for me, working within this field, it's very limited what I can try to change. At the moment, I have a thing around food waste, so I try to limit my food waste. But how many projects can we take on in terms of changing our impact? And it's difficult.
What is the message of your book, finally? When you are a brand, you may not lie anymore. Yeah.
And I mean, I think it's an obvious one. I mean, companies shouldn't be lying, and they should never have been lying. And I mean, it's actually an old advertising principle. I mean, one of the kind of, not founders of advertising, but one of the old madmen in advertising said that great communication can only make a bad product fail faster. So I mean, there always needs to be a bit of honesty in it. for me, the interesting part today is that because of social media and the whole accountability, companies are realizing, they cannot hide anything, and I mean that's why it's so important for people also to hold these companies accountable. If they find something that's wrong, if they have a question about ingredients or whatever, write the companies. And I mean, I even do it, and I see how good are they at responding.
There are lots of people who believe that advertising is bad whatsoever.
Yeah.
What can you answer to people who tell you that you cannot achieve a good goal by using bad tools?
Oh, that's a good one. I mean, advertising is facing some quite big challenges these days. I mean, the media landscape has changed quite dramatically. So, I mean, advertising, the traditional argument for advertising is, of course, showing more choices, offering information to consumers. And I mean, the big thing today is that a lot of that stuff we Google something, or we go in and read an expert review. So sometimes that can seem like a more biased sales pitch today. And I think the industry is doing a lot of efforts to find new ways and different ways of advertising. And for me, Goodvertising can be one of the answers. One of the things, for example, that I like at the moment is what Google have done recently in terms of when you, for example, search Copenhagen, Brussels, Google is automatically going to show you the different flight options and the different cost prices, all happening in the same browser. It's essentially advertising, but it's useful. Mm-hmm. So one of the questions I often ask my colleagues and the brands that I work with is, what is the value of advertising, and how can you put value back into advertising?
One of the best examples, it's in your book.
Yeah.
It's about a French brand called Intermarché with the ugly vegetables.
Yeah.
Is it a perfect example of sustainability, and advertising, because they took vegetables that we threw out in everyday life to make something positive?
I mean, it's really a great example, because you touch on the other thing, which is the awareness around sustainability. And this is where a brand can play a massive role in making consumers aware that there are things and there are practices that we do in our daily lives that are simply wrong. And I mean, they took their own medicine in a way. It came from one supermarket chain somewhere in France, and they scaled it up. Mm-hmm. And I think that's also a second thing that companies can do these days, is that if something works, they can scale it up. And the great thing about that campaign, because I studied it quite a bit, is that it spread to so many different markets. There's a supermarket chain in Germany that's taking it. But I mean, the awareness part, I don't think we should underestimate that, because if we really truly ask ourselves the question, how do we consume differently today? Because I think a lot of people point fingers at the companies and say, you should do this, you should do that. But if you ask yourself the question, how do you consume today? I mean, a lot of us probably don't consume that differently. And so I see two ways of changing that. One thing is, of course, the companies making us more aware about some of the better choices that we can do in our daily lives. And a lot of companies are working very stringently on doing that. And the second thing is for companies, which is the most successful approach, is to make it by default. So when you choose something, it's the more environmental right decision. And I mean, probably the car industry is a really great example of how an industry is slowly moving. I mean, some of the fuel consumption changes that's happening within the last 5 years, I think, are quite interesting.
Thomas Kolster, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Retrouvez les décodeurs RTBF chaque dimanche entre 10h et 11h en direct sur La Première et en podcast sur lapremière.be.